Hi, my name is Bryce. I'm going to be the assistant editor on this project. I got the AAF file that Terry's published from Flix. So I'm just going to drag and drop them into my Avid project, which will create all the clips for me, as well as a sequence that I can just double click on to see it directly in my timeline. So I do have the timing from story in this case because I did want to see that rough timing that Terry has recorded earlier. I know there's also a dialog file that's been provided along with this publish, so I'm just going to use the subcap effect to import those captions and display them directly in my Avid timeline. And now you'll see that that has created some clips on my V2 track with the dialogue in there. So obviously I'll play around with the placement of those captions. All right, so we're going to fast forward a little bit. So I put everything in Avid, and now the editor's taken over, and they've done a lot of things to the edit. So obviously played around with the timing a lot. There's a few shots that needed retiming. Second thing you'll notice is all the markers that have been added to start breaking down my shots, breaking down my sequence into shots. So they're all available on V1 on the first video track in there. Other things that we did, so we added a little camera move on this first board. So obviously we moved the dialogue position, and we added a couple of boards in there. We thought the statue would look better on a panel on its own. So we actually used 3 different panels to create that. We used the statue from one board, we used the bird from another board, and the background from a third board. And using a couple of effects like 3D warp and animat and resize and paint effects, and all very basic effects that you would have used in animation in editorial. And then we use this 2.5D push on this castle shot right here, because this is what the director wanted to then show in a final version. So now that we have all that, we're actually pretty happy with the sequence and happy to send it back to Flix. So we're going to just need to prep that sequence. So first off, I don't want to see the dialogue burnt in on the boards in Flix. I'm going to disable that track. I also created my own mixdown for the audio, so I can just disable all those other audio tracks so that they don't get included in the AAF, because that can end up being a very, very heavy AAF file. And from that point on, from Avid, I'm just going to export a single AAF file. Avid will take care of rendering all the effects that are on that sequence, just so that Flix can just read the AAF whenever there's an effect. It will grab those frames in and place them in the sequence where required. All right, now that Avid is done exporting the AF, I'm going to jump back into Flix, find the AF I just exported, and tell Flix to import that. I'm going to use render all frames to actually display all the effects directly back in Flix, and click on import. So once Flix is processing the AF, you'll notice there's going to be a bunch of clips directly relinking. There's been no effects added to those, and some clips with effects. The first one has a resize with the little camera move. And then there's the 2 panels that we added, on which we added some effects. So those will come back as ref panels as well. So now that's imported, I'll hand it back over to Terry, who will just have a look at Flix and see how this import turned out.
All right, this is Terry, and I'm now back as production coordinator, and I'm ready to take a look at the sequence that is back from Bryce, the assistant editor. I'm going to navigate to the revision marked back from edit. And notice we also have a check mark letting us know that it's coming from editorial. Now when we open this up, we notice we have some visual changes to our sequence in Flix. First thing I notice is that we now have markers in here. The markers are added in Avid, and it's now breaking out our sequence down into shots, and that's fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and play through the sequence to see the adjustments made by Bryce, and then inspect any changes that involve our story artist. Alright, I've gone through it and I see the most obvious change is timing, but now let's look at some specifics. In our first panel, we can see a reference icon. This is referring to any effects that were done to this panel into Avid, so we want to focus in on those. If I play, we can see that it's a pull-out on frame. Now this is not going to require a revision from our story artist. For these situations when we come back from edit and there are effects that don't require a revision, as a studio we decided that we're going to highlight these panels in green so that everyone's aware and the story artist knows that it's not going to require a revision. Now let's go down to the next panel with the reference icon. Okay, we can see that the bird has been removed and it's coming in during the next panel. So editorial wants the statue by itself before the bird arrives. Now this is going to require the story artist to make a revision. Now since these changes are quite obvious and our studio is quite comfortable with our highlighting system, we're going to highlight these panels with a decided color of blue. Story will know that it needs to be addressed, and if it needed specific instructions, we could use commenting or annotations. Now let's look at the next panel with the reference icon. This is a 2.5D push-in, so Story won't need to do anything to this panel, but it's a great reference for production on what needs to be done to the shot. Let's go ahead and put the green highlight on this panel. Okay, now I'm ready to save this. I'm going to comment that there are revisions from editorial, and then the story artist Terry can address these revisions. Okay, the revisions are done, and Terry is quite fast, so now let's take a look. We can see that the bird is gone, and the panel has been cleaned up nicely. That's great. And for the next panel, the bird is landing, and the board is also cleaned up. I'm going to remove the highlights at this point because we're good. Now, it's very possible that we'd be sending this back to edit and they could continue making adjustments. We would round trip between story and editorial for as many times needed. But for this sequence, we're good to go and ready to hand it off to production. I'm going to go ahead and save this and make a comment that it's ready for production handoff.